Andrea was a 5-year-old girl who loved spending her days with her mother, Sarah. Their life was simple but full of love. Sarah did everything she could to make her daughter feel special. She prepared her favorite meals, helped with schoolwork, and read bedtime stories every night. Everything changed on an ordinary day that started like any other but ended in devastation. That morning, Andrea went to school, unaware it would be the last time she saw her mother. It was late afternoon when the school principal entered the classroom and called Andrea. The serious tone in her voice and the worried look on her face signaled that something was wrong. Andrea was taken to the principal's office, where her father, George, was waiting. He stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, staring out at something in the distance. When Andrea entered, he turned his head slowly and sighed. "Andrea," he began, his voice strained, "your mother. She had an accident. She's gone." Those words hit Andrea like a blow. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling and her eyes wide with disbelief. George remained still, avoiding his daughter's gaze. "She's dead, Andrea. There's nothing more to be done," he said with a coldness that seemed unfathomable given the gravity of the news. Andrea began to cry, but George didn't hug her or try to comfort her. He just stood there, as if incapable of dealing with her pain or even his own. That night, back in a house that now felt emptier and larger than ever, Andrea sat on the couch hugging a pillow. The silence was oppressive. George entered the room, looked at his daughter for a few seconds and said, "You'll have to be strong. Things have changed, but we have to move on." With that, he went to his bedroom, leaving Andrea alone to cope with her grief. In the days that followed, George's coldness became more evident. He seemed to avoid speaking about Sarah, as if pretending nothing had happened. Andrea, however, couldn't stop thinking about her mother. One day, she tried to talk about how much she missed her. "Dad, Mom used to make pancakes on Saturdays. Can we do that too?" Without even looking up from his newspaper, George replied, "That won't bring your mother back. It's best to stop dwelling on it." Andrea lived alone with her father in the same house that once radiated warmth. George wasn't just cold, he was strict. If Andrea left something out of place or forgot to do a chore, he was quick to reprimand her. "Andrea, I've told you to put your things away. I won't keep cleaning up after you," he'd say in a tone that made her shrink. The love she had felt with Sarah seemed like a distant memory, almost like a dream she couldn't grasp anymore. The nights were especially hard. Andrea lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering the stories her mother used to tell her before sleep. George never did that. Instead, he would say a curt good night, if he said anything at all, and close the door without another word. Andrea felt a loneliness she had never experienced before, as if lost in a world she no longer understood. Despite everything, she still tried to find something good in her father. Maybe he was just sad like she was. Maybe the pain of losing Sarah had made him this way. But until she figured it out, Andrea had to face, day after day, the coldness and severity that now defined her life with George. The first time Mary visited Andrea after Sarah's death, her heart broke at the sight of the little girl. Andrea seemed smaller, thinner, with a vacant look Mary had never seen before. The house, once full of life when Sarah was around, now felt cold and disorganized. Mary knew the loss of her daughter was painful, but what worried her most was the environment Andrea was growing up in. As always, George appeared indifferent. He greeted Mary with a quick nod and disappeared into his room, leaving the two alone in the living room. "How are you, sweetheart?" Mary asked, sitting beside Andrea on the couch. The girl shrugged, staring at the floor. "I'm fine, Grandma," she murmured, though her voice was far from convincing. Mary held her granddaughter's hand and noticed how cold it was. "Have you been eating well? You look so thin," she pressed, her tone filled with concern. Andrea simply nodded, but the silence that followed was enough for Mary to know something was wrong. In the days that followed, Mary began visiting Andrea more frequently, always trying to coax a smile from her or learn more about how things were going with George. But each visit revealed something more troubling. The girl was more withdrawn than ever, and her behavior showed signs of anxiety. George, on the other hand, made no effort to hide his irritation at Mary's visits. "She's fine, Mary. You don't need to keep coming here all the time," he said one day, slamming the door behind her. Mary ignored his comment. Something inside her told her that Andrea needed her now more than ever. During one of her visits, Mary found Andrea sitting on the kitchen floor, eating a sandwich made of dry bread. "Why are you eating this? Didn't your dad make you dinner?" she asked, shocked. The girl looked up at her with teary eyes and whispered, "He said he didn't have time today." Mary felt a wave of indignation rise in her chest. How could George be so neglectful? The child clearly needed more care than he was willing or able to provide. It was then that Mary began to late at night, alone in her house. Mary mulled over the possibility of filing for custody. Her heart ached at the thought of confronting George, who had always been a difficult and temperamental man. However, the image of Andrea, thin and lonely, haunted her. "She's just a child. I can't leave her like this," she whispered to herself, trying to gather the courage for what she knew needed to be done. Mary also knew her financial situation wasn't ideal. As a retiree, she lived on a modest pension, and the idea of facing George, who had more resources, was daunting. Yet she couldn't ignore the clear signs of neglect. During a conversation with a close friend, she confided, "I know he's her father, but that doesn't mean he's taking care of her. She needs someone who truly loves and cares for her." Determined, Mary consulted a lawyer to discuss her options. As she listened to the explanations about the legal process, she felt the weight of the decision she was about to make. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew it was Andrea's only chance for a better life. That day, as she said goodbye to her granddaughter, Mary hugged her tightly. "I'm going to take care of you, my love. I promise I'll do whatever it takes," she said, tears in her eyes. Andrea returned the hug, not fully understanding what it meant but feeling, for the first time in weeks, that someone truly cared. George discovered Mary's custody filing by accident. After another long day at work, he came home to find an official letter left on the kitchen table. He opened it with little interest, but as he read, his expression hardened. "How dare she?" he muttered, crumpling the paper in his hands. Silently, he went upstairs to his bedroom, where he stayed for hours, stewing in a mix of anger and indignation. The next day, George confronted Mary directly. He showed up at her house unannounced, pounding on the door. When Mary opened it, he barged in without invitation. "What is this? You think you can just take my daughter from me?" His voice was sharp, almost a roar. Mary, staying calm, responded, "George, I have no choice. Andrea needs someone who cares for her, who loves her, and you're not doing that." Mary's firmness didn't intimidate him. Instead, it only fueled his rage. He pointed a finger at her, shouting, "If you think you'll succeed, you're sorely mistaken." George's initial hostility soon gave way to a calculated strategy. He realized that threats wouldn't get him anywhere, so he decided to act differently. In the days that followed, he began treating Andrea in a way he never had before. "Do you want to go to the mall tomorrow? We can buy some things for you," he suggested one evening, forcing a smile. Andrea, skeptical, nodded hesitantly. It felt strange to see her father trying to be affectionate, and she didn't know how to react. George bought expensive toys, new clothes, and even took Andrea on outings she had never imagined. During one of these outings, he said, "See how much fun we can have together. I'm your dad, Andrea. We're family. We don't need anyone else." Although Andrea was touched by the sudden attention, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His behavior seemed more like a performance than a genuine display of love. In addition to his attempts to win Andrea's trust, George also began planting doubts about Mary. During dinner, he casually remarked, "You know, your grandma is getting old. Taking care of a child like you must be very hard for her." Andrea looked at him, confused, but said nothing. It was clear he was trying to manipulate her, which only deepened her discomfort with him. George went even further by fabricating false evidence against Mary. One evening, while Andrea was in her room, he called a friend, asking for help creating a story to discredit her grandmother. She doesn't have money, lives in a crumbling house. Who in their right mind would give custody of a child to someone like that? He whispered over the phone, his tone low but filled with determination. George was willing to do anything to win. However, Andrea began to sense that her father's behavior was strange and contradictory. The coldness he had shown before was still there, but now it was accompanied by a superficial layer of kindness. It was as if he were wearing masks, switching them as needed. Andrea felt there was more to his actions than she could fully understand. The night was cold and silent, and Andrea struggled to fall asleep under blankets that felt heavier than usual. The tension in the house had been almost tangible ever since her father, George, started behaving so differently. The unexpected shopping trips, forced smiles, and unannounced outings left Andrea feeling confused and uneasy. Something didn't seem right, but she couldn't pinpoint what it was. That night, however, everything would change. As she lay in bed, Andrea heard voices coming from the living room. It was rare for George to have visitors, especially at this hour. Curious and with her heart racing, she quietly got out of bed and tiptoed to the top of the stairs. George's voice was lower than usual, but there was an urgency in his tone. Andrea sat down on the steps, leaning her head to listen more closely. "I need this to look real, you understand," George said. The other voice, one Andrea didn't recognize, replied something inaudible. "If Mary wins custody, I'm finished," George continued, his words sending chills down Andrea's spine. "She can't take Andrea. I can't lose this, the money that comes with her." Andrea felt the ground fall away beneath her. What was he talking about? Money. She struggled to steady her breathing as she continued to listen. "I've already planted stories about her instability," George said, now sounding more confident. "But I need you to help me with the documents. It has to seem like she's completely unfit to care for a child. She's old, frail, and Andrea will only suffer with her." There was a pause before George let out a short, humorless laugh. "No one's going to believe I'm the problem here. I'm her father after all." Tears streamed down Andrea's face. Those words cut through her like a knife. She had always known her father was cold, but she never imagined he could be so calculated and manipulative. For a moment, she thought about running down the stairs to confront him, but fear held her back. What if he lied? What if he claimed she misunderstood? No, she needed to think carefully about her next steps. Quietly retreating to her room, Andrea closed the door and sat on her bed, hugging her knees. Her mind raced as recent memories started to fall into place. The gifts, the outings, the forced smiles. All of it was part of a plan to deceive her, to convince everyone that he was a perfect father. "He doesn't care about me," she whispered to herself, sobbing softly. "He only cares about what's best for him." That night, Andrea couldn't sleep. George's words echoed in her head. She thought about her grandmother, Mary, and the effort she made to care for her even with so little. She remembered the warm embrace Mary gave her when she promised to protect her. Now Andrea knew she had to do something to help her grandmother, but the idea of standing up to her father terrified her. The next morning, the house was as silent as ever. George acted as though nothing had happened, serving breakfast in his typical detached manner. "Did you sleep well, Andrea?" he asked without looking at her. The girl simply nodded, trying to hide the storm of emotions brewing inside her. He seemed completely unaware that his daughter had uncovered his secrets. As Andrea got ready to leave for school, she paused at the door for a moment. She looked at her father, who was sitting on the couch engrossed in his phone, and felt a wave of sadness mixed with anger. It wasn't fair that he could manipulate everything so easily. It wasn't fair that Mary, the only person who truly loved her, had to fight against so many lies. With a heavy heart, Andrea knew her decision was made. She would have to reveal what she had overheard, even if it meant confronting the man who now seemed more of a stranger than a father. The day of the hearing arrived under a gray sky, the weather mirroring the weight Andrea felt in her heart. She had barely slept the night before, knowing she faced the daunting task of exposing the truth that had been tormenting her. Beside her, Mary, her grandmother, dressed simply but with dignity, held her hand firmly as they walked into the courthouse. George, in contrast, was impeccably dressed and accompanied by his lawyer, his expression exuding confidence and superiority. But Andrea knew what lay behind that rehearsed smile and was determined to bring his lies to light. In the courtroom, the air was heavy. Mary sat beside Andrea, who clung to her grandmother's arm as if it could give her strength. Andrea sat silently. George, on the other side, sat rigidly, casting quick glances at the judge and the audience. When his lawyer began speaking, the room fell into a deep silence. My client, George, is a dedicated father who has taken on all responsibilities after the tragic loss of his wife. He provides his daughter, Andrea, with a stable and secure environment, while Mrs. Mary unfortunately lacks the necessary resources to care for her. The words were like knives to Mary, but she maintained her composure. When it was her turn, she stood and addressed the judge with her head held high. Your Honor, I love my granddaughter more than anything. I know I don't have wealth, but I have something far more important: love, dedication, and the will to protect her. Since my daughter's death, Andrea has lived in an environment of coldness and neglect. She needs a home where she feels safe. George's lawyer was quick to counter. Your Honor, with all due respect, Mrs. Mary is of advanced age and lacks the financial or physical means to care for Andrea. Furthermore, we have evidence that she has interfered in the relationship between father and daughter. George seized the moment to stand. I only want what's best for my daughter. I've done everything I could for her. It's hard to see that my mother-in-law doesn't trust me as a father, he said, with an expression so convincing it almost fooled the room. Andrea felt a lump form in her throat. While the adults debated what was best for her, no one seemed to be hearing the real story. George's lies were piling up, and she knew it was time to speak. Trembling, she stood up. Daddy is lying, she said in a small voice, but one loud enough to silence the entire courtroom. The judge looked at her attentively. Andrea, do you want to say something? She asked, her tone a mix of surprise and gentleness. George turned to his daughter, his eyes wide as if unable to believe what was happening. Andrea, sit down. Don't say things you don't understand, he ordered. But the judge raised her hand, stopping him. Let her speak. Andrea took a deep breath, trying to hold back tears. Her voice trembled, but she knew she had to say everything. He doesn't care about me, she began, looking directly at the judge. He never did. All he wants is the life insurance money, the money that was supposed to be for me from my mom. He wants it all for himself. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even George's lawyer seemed at a loss for words. I heard him talking on the phone, Andrea continued, her voice growing stronger. He said he needed to get Mom out of the way because she controlled the insurance. He sabotaged her car. He made it break on purpose. He's the one who caused the accident. Tears streamed down her face as she went on. After Mom died, he told me things would get better, but they didn't. He left me alone, treated me badly, and now he's pretending to care just to get the money. He wants to get rid of me too. I heard him say that. George shot to his feet, his face red with anger. This is absurd. She's confused. She's just a child, he shouted. But the judge interrupted him firmly. Silence, Mr. George, she commanded. She turned back to Andrea, her expression now serious. Andrea, these are very serious accusations. Are you sure about what you're saying? Andrea nodded vigorously. I heard him say it. He was on the phone laughing. He said he didn't have to worry about Mom anymore, that everything was settled. And now he wants to do the same to me. He wants to take everything that was meant for me. Her words were like an earthquake, shaking the courtroom. The judge paused for a long moment, looking at George with clear disapproval. These allegations will be investigated immediately, she declared before calling a recess. George sat down, visibly shaken, while Mary embraced Andrea tightly. You were so brave, my love. I'm so proud of you, her grandmother said, tears streaming down her face. As the room began to empty, Andrea felt an odd sense of relief. She knew she had exposed the truth, even if it meant facing her own father. For the first time in a long while, she felt closer to justice, not just for herself but for her mother. The court recess was brief, but the impact of Andrea's revelations reverberated like a shockwave. When everyone returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was even heavier. George, who had exuded confidence. Earlier, he had exuded confidence, but now George seemed like a shadow of his former self. He sat with his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, avoiding all eye contact. Andrea, on the other hand, felt Mary's hands firmly holding hers, a silent gesture of support. The words Andrea had spoken earlier still echoed in her mind, and the courage it had taken to say them was both a relief and a burden. The judge entered, and silence fell over the room like a blanket. After hearing the testimonies and considering the grave accusations raised, I have decided that immediate actions must be taken, she announced, her voice commanding the room's full attention. Andrea glanced at Mary, trying to decipher what would come next, while George sat motionless as though unwilling to hear what was about to be said. Mr. George, the judge continued, in light of the accusations of neglect and potential criminal actions surrounding the accident that resulted in Andrea's mother's death, I am ordering your preventive detention to ensure the integrity of the investigation. Furthermore, Andrea will be placed under the temporary guardianship of her grandmother, Mary, until a final decision is reached. Her words echoed in the courtroom, followed by a low murmur of surprise and shock. George abruptly stood, his face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. I'm her father. This is unfair. He shouted but was quickly restrained by a court officer who approached to escort him out of the room. As he was led away, he cast one last look at Andrea, a mix of desperation and something darker. Andrea avoided his gaze, gripping Mary's hand even tighter. Watching her father being taken away brought a mix of emotions to Andrea. There was a sense of justice being served but also a deep sadness. Despite everything, he was still her father, and the idea that he could have done something so terrible left her torn. Mary, sensing the whirlwind of emotions in her granddaughter, knelt down to meet her at eye level. You were very brave today, Andrea. I know this isn't easy, but you did what you had to do, she said, her voice soft and filled with love. The ride back home was quiet. Andrea stared out the car window, watching the city lights blur past. When they arrived at Mary's modest home, she felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. The house was simple, but it held an inviting sense of safety. Mary had prepared a small room for Andrea, with a soft quilt and an old lamp that cast gentle shadows on the walls. I know it's not much, Mary said as she helped Andrea settle in, but I'll do everything I can to make you feel safe here. Andrea nodded, offering a shy smile. For the first time in weeks, she felt free to cry without fear of being reprimanded. Mary sat beside her on the bed, running her hand through Andrea's hair. It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. We'll get through this together, she whispered. In that moment, Andrea began to believe that was possible. The days that followed were a mix of relief and adjustment. Without George around, Andrea felt a weight lifted from her shoulders, though echoes of the past still haunted her. At times, she woke in the middle of the night, her heart racing, recalling the look her father had given her in court. Other times, memories of warm conversations with her mother filled her with an unbearable emptiness. Mary, on the other hand, worked hard to create a routine that brought a sense of normalcy to Andrea's life. She prepared simple meals, helped with homework, and read bedtime stories like Sarah used to. This was one of your mom's favorite stories, Mary said one night as she read from an old book. Andrea smiled, feeling closer to her mother through the small memories Mary shared. Despite the initial relief, both knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. The court's final decision still loomed, and the possibility of George trying to turn the situation in his favor cast a shadow over their newfound peace. We'll keep fighting, Mary said one afternoon while making tea in their small kitchen, because you deserve a life full of love and peace. Andrea looked at her grandmother, her eyes shining with newfound determination. "I know, Grandma, and I'll do my part too." In that moment, Andrea realized that despite all she had lost, there was something no one could take away: the courage to fight for herself and the hope that better days lay ahead. The weeks following the initial hearing felt like an eternity. Mary's home had become a refuge for Andrea, but both knew the battle was far from over. Each letter from the court and every update on the investigations left Mary anxious. Andrea, meanwhile, tried to keep herself busy with schoolwork and the small routines her grandmother had created, but the constant undercurrent of uncertainty was hard to ignore. She knew that her life's fate was about to be decided. The day of the final hearing dawned with a bright morning, but Andrea's heart was heavy with apprehension. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more charged than before. George was present, but this time in handcuffs, flanked by 2 officers. He looked haggard but still carried an air of arrogance. Andrea felt a shiver as their eyes briefly met, and she quickly looked away. Mary sat by Andrea's side, her face serious and focused. She knew this was the most important moment of their lives. George's lawyer seemed uncomfortable, as if he knew the odds were no longer in his favor. Waned as Mary's attorney, a volunteer who had guided her through the process, appeared calm yet vigilant, ready to counter every argument. The judge entered the room, and silence enveloped the space. "We are here to conclude the custody case involving the minor Andrea, as well as to address the criminal charges against Mr. George," she began, her authoritative tone immediately commanding everyone's attention. She reviewed the documents before asking the parties to present their final arguments. George's lawyer spoke first, making a last-ditch effort to salvage his client's image. "Your Honor, my client is a father who has made mistakes, as we all do, but he loves his daughter deeply and wishes for a second chance to prove he can be a good parent," he said, occasionally glancing at George, as if to reinforce the image of regret. Mary's breathing quickened as the lawyer continued. "Furthermore, the allegations against Mr. George lack concrete evidence. There are no direct proofs that he sabotaged the vehicle of Andrea's mother, and we cannot base such a serious decision on mere assumptions." When it was Mary's turn, she stood with the dignity of someone who knew she was fighting for the truth. Her lawyer began by presenting the evidence gathered during the investigations. "Your Honor, the life insurance mentioned by Andrea was indeed intended for her. Financial documents show that Mr. George attempted to change the beneficiaries just days after the death of Andrea's mother, a highly suspicious action." He went on to detail the results of the car inspections, which revealed clear signs of tampering. Then it was Andrea's turn. The young girl took a deep breath before standing up. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her words. "I don't want to stay with my dad," she began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "He never treated me well. He never cared about me or my mom. All he wanted was the money, and he did it. He sabotaged the car. He knew my mom was going to die." Andrea looked at the judge, tears rolling down her face. "I heard him talk about it on the phone. He said it was the only way to get the insurance money. He said I was just a problem to him and that he wanted to get rid of me too." Her words cut through the silence of the room like a blade, leaving even George's lawyer speechless. The judge paused for a long moment before speaking again. "These accusations are extremely serious. After considering the testimonies and evidence presented, this court concludes that Mr. George acted negligently and possibly criminally." George tried to intervene, but he was immediately restrained by the officers beside him. "As for Andrea's custody," the judge continued, "I hereby award permanent guardianship to Mrs. Mary. She has demonstrated that she is the most suitable figure to provide the child with the safe and loving environment she needs." The judge's voice was firm, but there was a note of compassion as she looked at Andrea and Mary. The judge's final words felt like a weight lifting off Andrea's shoulders. Mary hugged her granddaughter tightly, both of them crying together. "It's over, my love," Mary whispered. "You're safe now." As George was escorted out of the courtroom, he cast one last glance at Andrea, but she didn't look away. For the first time she felt stronger than him. Justice had prevailed, and despite all they had endured, she and Mary now had the chance to start anew. The days following the court's decision brought a sense of relief Andrea hadn't felt in a long time. She and Mary returned to the modest house, but this time everything felt different. The space now carried a feeling of safety and peace that Andrea barely recognized but embraced wholeheartedly. It was as if the storm that had loomed over them for so long had finally passed, leaving a clear and hopeful horizon. Determined to provide Andrea with as much as she could, Mary cleaned and reorganized the house, transforming a small room into a cozy sanctuary for her granddaughter. The walls were painted in soft colors, adorned with drawings that reflected the carefree childhood Andrea deserved. On the desk, Mary placed a framed photo of Sarah, smiling warmly just as Andrea remembered. "So you'll never forget how much she loved you," Mary said, resting a comforting hand on Andrea's shoulder. Though still carrying the weight of past traumas, Andrea slowly began to open up to this new chapter of her life. She started attending a new school, where she made friends who welcomed her with kindness and curiosity. "You're Mrs. Mary's granddaughter, right? She's so sweet," one classmate remarked. Andrea smiled, feeling a flicker of pride at the mention of her grandmother. At home, the days were filled with simple yet precious moments. Mary made it a point to cook warm meals and sit at the table with Andrea, asking about her day. At night, she continued the bedtime story tradition that Sarah had begun. "This was one of your mom's favorite stories," Mary would say as she read from an old book while Andrea listened intently, clutching a teddy bear her mother had given her years ago. One afternoon, while they were tidying the front garden, Andrea asked, "Grandma, do you think Mom can see us?" Mary paused, wiping her forehead with her hand. "I believe she can, sweetheart, and I think she's very proud of you. You've been so brave." Andrea smiled, though her eyes filled with tears. She felt Mary's embrace before the tears could fall. "We're together now, and that's what matters," her grandmother reassured her. The most memorable moment came when Mary decided to take Andrea to a park that Sarah used to visit with her daughter. It was a simple place with tall trees and an old swing, but to Andrea it felt magical. "Your mom loved coming here," Mary said. It was the place where she felt most connected to life. Mary shared this as she watched Andrea run across the grassy field, laughing for the first time in ages. As Andrea played on the swing, Mary sat on a nearby bench, observing her with a mix of joy and relief. The hardships they had endured now felt distant, almost like a nightmare that was finally over. When Andrea ran back to her, breathless and smiling, Mary cupped her face with both hands. "You're my strong girl. Never forget that," she said, planting a gentle kiss on Andrea's forehead. Andrea looked up at Mary and, with the innocence of a child beginning to understand the value of love and resilience, replied, "You're strong too, Grandma. Stronger than anyone I know." Mary smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. The two sat together on the grass, gazing at the sky where clouds drifted slowly, as if dancing in harmony with the wind. Rebuilding their lives wouldn't be easy, but both were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Andrea knew she had lost so much, but she had also gained something precious: the certainty that love could heal even the deepest wounds. And Mary, despite her age and the obstacles they'd faced, felt renewed because in the end, having Andrea by her side was all that mattered.